All right, good morning as we gather to our seats, as we come together, to make our way. It's good to see all of you. This is excellent. Y'all are much better than my college students. Normally takes them a minute. Good morning. It is so good to be with all of you today on this morning, Friday, April 21st, here for our annual gathering, our first in-person annual gathering of the Alliance of Baptists since the pandemic. We met in November as a smaller group, but for the very first time since 2019, we've been able to gather here for this. And so I think that's something worth celebrating. And it's so good to see all of your faces and all of you. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Zehyoue, and I have the privilege of serving as the co-director of the Alliance of Baptists with Carol Collins. Carol and I have been tasked by you, the body of the Alliance of Baptists, to help guide in consultation and partnership with our board of directors, with our staff, with the churches, individuals, partners, supporters, everyone who makes up this amorphous body spread out across the country and the world that is the Alliance of Baptists, to become an anti-racist organization. In 2018, when I was just a board member and a church member and a pastor, associate pastor at Calvary Baptist Church, the Alliance made a decision that it wanted to reorient itself, to refocus itself, to deepen its mission by becoming an anti-racist organization. And so the Alliance appointed a group of people, a racial justice task force, in true Baptist fashion, a committee to go through the bylaws and the important documents of the Alliance to see what we needed to do to become this anti-racist organization. And out of that labor, out of that work, came 116 recommendations that Alliance people put together that said that if we were going to become an anti-racist organization, these were the things that we needed to do. That's a part of how I got to the role that I am in. That is a part of how me and Carol were tasked with leading the staff to do this work. And it was a part of how our annual gathering has taken on this theme of abolitionism. It has grown out of the organic energy of the Alliance of Baptists, who have committed themselves, you all have committed to trying to do some good in the world, fully cognizant that to do good in our world now requires an understanding of how our world has come to be and how we have contributed to the ways in which it has come to be. So when I was tasked to help lead us in this effort to become an anti-racist organization as a historian and a theologian and a pastor, the primary way that I knew how to do that was to first start with history, and then to follow, as Ben has already laid out for us today, the vision of movements that offer an alternative to that history. So this past November, 150 of us went down to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Lynching Museum and Memorial, which tells the story of a part of that history, a part of how white supremacy is deep in the soil. We stood under those blocks representing people and names from every county in the US where there was a lynching. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, East Baton Rouge Parish. There are 5 names from my parish. We did that, and then we walked through Baptist history to help us understand how our institution, our organization, a historically Southern and historically white Baptist organization. Notice how I didn't say a Southern Baptist. Organization has deep ties to this. For those of you who are interested, that lecture either is or will be available on our website to learn more. There are many resources that we've tried to provide throughout. With that in the background, we meet here for this conversation. So if Baptists, primarily centered around the South, participated in the construction of an oppressive and violent system of white supremacy from enslavement to the current era, the question is then, how can other groups of Baptists who want to be moral in the world, how can we be a part of repairing some of the breaches that our ancestors and some of our cousins have been a part of making? As Ben told us this morning, there have been 2 primary traditions in the church. The difference between those 2 has been whether or not it has taken seriously the call for abolition. So this morning, in about the hour and 15 minutes or so that we have together, I want us to unpack what abolition means and why we, as leaders of the Alliance of Baptists, think it's an important movement for the Alliance of Baptists to understand, to know about, and if so, will and choose to participate in. The abolitionist movement calls for a transformation of relations of power in the world. It argues that we need to transform the way power functions in our world because as it currently stands, as it currently exists, it's fundamentally oppressive, fundamentally violent. In the most visceral way, abolitionists argue that we can see that in the modern system of incarceration, in the modern system of policing. Abolitionists argue that there's a line that can be drawn from the period of enslavement. If you're starting with the English colonies, 1619, Virginia, Port Comfort, 20-some odd Africans were sold coming aboard the White Lion. Jamestown, founded in 1608, within 11 years of the existence of the settlement that would become the United States of America, we had enslavement. By 1662, we have a reframing, a redefining of permanent and lifelong enslavement. One of the things I tell my students, did this have to be written down? It was written down because obviously enslaved people were struggling against their condition. So enslavement is old and deep in the soil of our country, and so is the abolitionist movement. If you've ever been to one of the slave castles on the west coast of Africa, you can see that there are still cannons that point inward towards the African interior. It's a reminder that from the moment of captivity, there was a resistance to enslavement. And so abolitionists argue that there's a line that can be drawn from enslavement and the injustices of that international system, a system where tobacco grown in Virginia, cotton picked in Mississippi, sugar cultivated in Barbados, made its way to rum, produced in London, textiles in Massachusetts, cigars all over the world. Abolitionists argue that there's a direct line from enslavement in that international system to today, to our current system of mass incarceration, our current system of police violence, of police brutality, of white supremacy. And abolitionists evoke, they call from within for us, for those who believe in freedom, to not rest until we get there. So I've entitled this conversation that we're having this morning, A Brief Moment in the Sun, from slavery to abolition. And this quote comes from William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, who in 1935, in his book, Black Reconstruction, which I recommend. I know that at least one person in here has read it. Rick, where are you? I know Rick has read it. So I gave it to him when he was my church member. And within a week, he gave it back to me and had questions. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, this period from 1865 to 1877, between the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, to 1877, and the Great Compromise, as it was called. Those 12 years, Du Bois did a study of that period in order to answer the question of how the conditions of those people who were enslaved changed. From 1865 to 1877, this is what William Edward Burghardt Du Bois said. W.B. Du Bois said, "The slave went free and stood for a brief moment in the sun, only to then be pushed back towards slavery again." Slave went free and stood for a brief moment in the sun, only to then be pushed back into slavery again. So what happened? 1865, we have the 13th Amendment, abolishes slavery. We have the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, giving black men at that time the right to vote, recognizing that black folk born in this country could become citizens. And you gotta think about it. From 1776 to 1865, you got a bunch of people born on this soil, but they're not American. They were called during that era the radical Republicans. They pushed through with black folk, 2 black senators from Mississippi, 2 black senators from South Carolina, several hundred black representatives in the state houses of the South. A radical new program of reimagining this society. But in 1877, Andrew Johnson made a compromise with the former Confederates. Said, let us back into the country. We promise we'll play nice. So the federal government agreed. They pulled the federal troops out of the South. And they gave those who controlled the Confederacy back their land. And many black folk who had stood for a brief moment in the sun were gradually pushed back towards slavery again. The period between 1877 and 1960 is known as the nadir, the low point. That's the era of American lynchings. Thousands of recorded lynchings. How many more? Unrecorded. In Montgomery, we talked about some of the lynchings that happened on Sunday after church with the preacher's blessing. And then for another brief moment in the sun, about another 12 years, there was some hope. But in response to that, our carceral system expanded. Policing tactics were used to discredit and delegitimize civil rights leaders, from Martin King to Malcolm X to Ella Baker. FBI files on all of them. Covering their deepest moments, trying to prove that they weren't really good people after all, because they were trying to abolish a system of slavery that had evolved and metastasized over time. That is some of the historical basis for the abolitionist movement. That the criminal justice system, or criminal legal system rather, that we have today is a result of the system of enslavement that so many people struggled against years ago. And the argument is that we need abolition today because the system of enslavement has not yet been abolished. And what I want to say to y'all, as a group of Baptists who are historically from the South, and if not from the South, from the United States, where Malcolm X said that the entire United States was the South.
He was right.
Is that since we didn't have enough Baptist abolitionists back then, can we get a few more now? So I want to invite some friends to join me to help further unpack this, because it's not just a historical conversation. It's one that impacts our theology, it impacts our imagination, it impacts how we function in the world. It's obviously connected to our criminal legal system, to policing, to education, to banking. And so I want to invite some friends to help me and to help us further unpack its impact. And so I want to invite first my friend and my colleague, one of my best friends, grew up with him in Baton Rouge, Jeremy Tinsley. Jeremy, come on up and join us, come sit next to me. Jeremy is a public defender with Neighborhood Defender Services in Harlem, New York. And we'll hear a little bit more about Jeremy's work as a public defender within New York City, which is seen as one of the most progressive cities in the country and perhaps the world. And Jeremy will share a little bit of his experiences as a public defender within that context and what he has learned about our criminal legal system, and perhaps how he has gotten to a place where he too, as a public defender, calls for a major transformation of that system. I would also like to invite up Paige White, who is also a former public defender from Harlem and DC, and worked within both of those two major urban centers to represent incarcerated people and people facing incarcerations. And Paige's work has now taken her to defend those victims of police brutality. Paige works with Benjamin Crump in trying to draw attention to all of the police violence and police brutality that happens. So Paige, thank you for joining us as well. I want to invite my friend, Reverend Alfonso Campbell, who is a pastor and a dreamer and an artist, who was one of the first people to introduce me to this movement, who was really formed by the killing of George Floyd in 2020, and was a leader in that movement when so many people went out into the streets in the middle of a pandemic to offer dissenting voices. And to my friend, Minister Alexis Tardy, who has been working with the Alliance Baptist as we try to wrestle with all of these problems and challenges, and has been helping us as a womanist theologian and as an organizer who got her start in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown Jr. was killed in 2014, to also be a part of this conversation. And so my friends from these various life stations and places help us unpack this. Why abolition? How'd you get there, Paige? Yeah.
Hello? Oh, it is. Okay. Hi, everyone. How did we get here? I think that seeing the criminal legal justice system at play for 6 years of my life in DC and New York really helped solidify that there really is no other option. The current system that we have, and when we're talking about abolition, it comes in a lot of different forms, but I'm going to specifically talk about prison abolition. and abolition of our current policing system, there is just no other option. As many of you know, the police started off as slave catchers. And I'd submit to you that they are employing the same behaviors that they did back in the terms of enslavement that they are now. As Elijah just said, I work with attorney Ben Crump, and I also work at DeCello Levitt, and we represent the family of Jalen Walker, who was shot 90 times by the Akron Police Department in Akron, Ohio. As many of you know from watching the news, a grand jury chose not to indict a single officer in that case, not one. And I was the lawyer that had to tell the family that news. And when you really see the effects of our current policing system, the fact that police can literally hunt people, because that's what they did to Jalen. They hunted him. They unleashed horrific and unspeakable violence upon his body and that community and that family. And not only is there no consequences to that action, but in fact, the police are now continuing to employ violence on people who are protesting and just were tear gassing children yesterday. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? And for me, it's really, abolition is the only choice because our current system doesn't treat humans as humans. And especially Black and brown humans are not seen as people. I can tell stories about my time in DC and New York, but I'll tell you one, and there's so much that I want to say, and I want to make sure that my other panelists get a point, but the three main pillars of abolition are moratorium, so stop building jails, stop building prisons. We have plenty. And so if we don't have more prisons, we don't have more need to put people in prison. The second is decarceration. So what we have deemed as crimes, such as people laying on a park bench, or people having mental health episodes. We need to stop classifying that as a crime and start looking to other alternatives. If someone sleeping on a park bench was not deemed a crime, then we would respond differently. But we have been encoded since we're younger to see certain acts and certain people as criminals. And so once we start to change that, then we start to change how we respond to them. And the third is excarceration. And that means that we are really looking at where we can put our resources in education and in housing. If we provide housing to homeless people, that is police reform. When we provide educational services to children who don't have anywhere to go after school and their parents are working 3 jobs, that is police reform. And so the story that I want to share with you, when I was in New York City, I had a client who had had a mental health episode. He was sleeping in Grand Central Station on Christmas Eve. And the police woke him up and said, you can't sleep here, you got to get out of here. He had no idea who they were, and had kicked one of them, I believe. He was arrested for assault in the 2nd degree. And he was not granted bail. He was so mentally ill, he did not know who I was. He could not comprehend what had happened to him. He had no idea what was going on. And to find out on top of that, he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the cancer would cause his body to fill up with feces, until he was in such pain that he would have to be taken to the hospital, it would be drained, and he would be put back. They did not have the services at the jail and on Rikers Island to treat cancer. And so the judge, who had just beat cancer the year before, would not release him, would not do it. The prosecutor on the case also would not release him and gave their thoughts and prayers. And he died in Rikers Island. And so my answer is just something has to change, and you can't reform a death squad. You can't reform slave catchers. You just can't. And when we stop looking to the police to be the answer, because many, many times they are not, then we start to really reimagine our society and start to see each other in our humanity. And so that is my very long answer to your short question.
No, thank you, Paige. You say, right, that we cannot reform a death squad, right? And Alexis, as a womanist theologian, you've taught us, right, that womanism is about personal and communal healing. How do you come to this work of abolitionists? How did you come as someone out of the church, that and still ministers within the church and organizes people of faith, and especially Christians, right, to do this moral work? How did you come to this?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, that's a great question. I guess first I come as a Black woman before anything else, because we all live these experiences in these lived bodies. And I think my driving ethic more and more is a scripture I keep thinking about. I am the good shepherd. I come that you may have life and that you may have it more abundantly. And I think about what Ruth E. Wilson Gilmore says, and a lot of abolitionists say, where life is precious, life is precious. And that is my thesis, right? That is my, womanism talks about wholeness and healing and community. So if these systems, institutions, police, are about violence work, are about death dealing institutions, then I am against that. Because where life is precious, life is precious. And I think that is the way that I come to this work as a Black woman, as someone who is committed to womanist values, but also committed, I think, to abolitionist values as well. And I think as ministers, when we look at the life of Jesus, it just seems, I think as Ben was preaching this morning, inseparable to the commitments of abolitionists as well. And so when police and prisons are doing violence work, that is not something that I can commit to. That is something that I am against. And I think as Christ followers, that is something that we are all called to be against. So that is the way that I come to this work. And I think that not just abolition, but as Dr. Joy James talks about, abolition and racial capitalism, and how they're connected, but racial capitalism may be the driving engine of that. So we can't talk about abolition without talking about racial capitalism. And she also talks about how abolition is not singular, but it's abolitionisms with an S. And historically, that has always been the case. She talks about how Frederick Douglass' abolition is different from John Brown's abolition, which is different from Harriet Tubman's abolition. The call for us is to figure out the best abolition and to live that out. So those are the things that I am ultimately committed to.
Thank you for that. Jeremy, when you first went to New York, we were starting our roles around the same time. You went to be a public defender when I went to be a pastor. And my first day as a pastor was August 10th, 2014. It was a Sunday after Michael Brown Jr. had been killed. And Jeremy and I were roommates at the time. And Jeremy was on Twitter, and I think you were the first one to send the image of Mike Brown's body which had been lying there to me. And then the next day, I had to go to church and introduce myself and try to figure out what to say. Shortly after you went to New York and became a public defender and we would talk, you would tell me stories about your clients, and over time, your stories would get even more and more intense of the things that they were facing. And so I'm just curious, for you as someone from Louisiana, from the South, how did you come to this? Why is this something you care about?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, a long answer, and I'll try to probably do my best to explain that. So, I mean, for me, one, like, to come to be a public defender, like, a lot of that was sparked in me when I was in law school. Like, the first year I was in law school was the year that Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida. And I remember, like, my second year of law school, my second summer, interning in the DC Public Defender's Office. That was the summer that the trial happened of George Zimmerman and his eventual not guilty finding by the jury there. And I think so much of the driving force for me to come into first my work was that I personally witnessed firsthand so much of the unfairness, so much of the violence that police were inflicting on communities, specifically for individuals that look like me, that I wanted to put myself in the way and do what I could to help people in those situations. And so I began a public defender with the goal to try my best to keep the worst outcomes basically from happening to folks charged with crimes where I am now in New York City. And over time, like, the longer you do this work, the more intense it gets, because the more experience you get, the more serious cases you're getting, the more people who are facing more years in jail, and so it wears on you. And so, and you see, like, how all these things, they really, like, are symptoms of really the same thing, right? Like, Paige was talking about, like, how like, what people need, right, on a day-to-day basis in our communities, like housing, education, work, stability, things like that give life, right? And that we operate in death-making institutions, things like Rikers Island is the jail in New York City where everybody who is incarcerated pre-trial goes. Last year, 2022, I can't remember the exact number, I want to say 22 people died in Rikers Island, the most ever in a single year. Now, in New York State, our governor, who is voted as a Democrat, is seeking to scale back reforms that were put in place in 2019 that lessened the amount of people who were incarcerated pre-trial before they're actually convicted of any crime at all, and sent to Rikers Island. She wants to scale those reforms back so that more people can be put in jail pre-trial. And so, like, part of our work is obviously, like, fighting against these things from happening and fighting against these people and these institutions who seek to put our clients in positions where they are subject to these terrible outcomes. And so for me, like, my role, in seeing my role over the years, I have, I think, come to the viewpoint that, like, it's, like, I can do as much as I can a lot of times, but these institutions are so big and that there are so many things that happen that it is almost impossible for us to get the best thing to happen. Like, sometimes the best thing that can happen for my clients is that they get 3 years instead of 10 years in prison, right? Like, that, those are the choices that my clients have to face. Like, literally, I want to say, like, 3-4 weeks ago, like, I was in the middle of a trial where my client faced anywhere from 5 to 25 years. And we were getting terrible rulings from a judge that would have basically made us lose that trial. And so my client, seeing these things happen, like he's making the choice, like on the spot, like it would be better for me to take this plea to 4 years where I know the outcome versus dealing with these variables and dealing with these outcomes where I might be subject to a double-digit sentence when I've never been to prison at all. And so me seeing those things happen on a regular basis, it has really instilled the thought in me that there is no real justice that comes from the system that we currently operate in, because it can't. Like the way, like I was reading, I think like a book, Becoming an Abolitionist, yesterday, or when I was flying back from somewhere else, and it said that you can't create fairness in a fundamentally unequal system. And that's basically like what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to say like, oh, you know, see this person as a human, don't treat him the same way this system regularly treats everybody else. But because it's a system, they do the same things, they, in terms of judges, prosecutors, they do the same things over and over, do the same sentences, hand out the same amounts of bail. And so in order for me to really be honest with myself about like how I can change this work, I think that it has to be that the system has to be done away with. And you think about like how much money and how much it takes to really incarcerate someone. One of my clients made something very clear to me, like maybe about a month or so ago, is that in New York City, to incarcerate one person on Rikers Island, it takes $500,000 a year. And to think about what else could be done with that money, it is absurd to just really like think about. Like my client was someone who is dealing with substance abuse, mental illness, and so he would go into stores and take things, and so that's how he ended up there. And so like if you address obviously the underlying causes, that is public safety, right? If you give people housing, if you give people safety, real safety is security, right? In their own work, in their own house, in their own families. And so, yeah, that's kind of the long answer as to like how I ended up in this position where I am now, and like what I think about abolitionism, and I guess the role that I play in how we can keep working towards that.
No, thank you for sharing, Jeremy. And I remember, you know, when you told me about that client, you said it was $500,000 to incarcerate a person in New York City, and your client said back to you, what, like if I had that, my life would be totally different.
If he said, even if you give me 100,000, right? You know what I mean? Like if you give them a fraction of that amount of money, like they would, like everything about their life would change, right? But we spend so much money, so much effort to throw people away, essentially, right? And to put them in cages, and it doesn't benefit us as a society, right? It doesn't contribute to any real public safety. And yeah, it just keeps the churn going.
Speaking of keeping the churn going, Trey, you were, I think, on the front lines in some real ways in Washington, D.C., your hometown, in 2020. And you would talk to me about how you stood in front of military tanks, right? As you were with a group of people protesting George Floyd's murder. And I know those moments really impacted you. How did you as and forgive me, I mean, I know you, so as even a somewhat privileged Black person, right? Out in the suburbs, great family, how did you find yourself, in front of these tanks, and how did that shape you? How did you come to this?
Right. I'm trying not to be a Black Baptist preacher right now and be long-winded. Trying hard not to when the mic is in your hand. But I mean, as you know, this starts with my family, right? I am the son of a father who grew up in Montgomery, Alabama during the heart of that time, right? Grandparents who were a part of those movements, right? Like heavily part of the Montgomery bus boycott movement at the time. And so for me, that orientation of justice has always been there since birth. And, even thinking about my father, he having to see Emmett Till at his age, right? I think 8 years old at that time. And then that's passed down to me, right? Like one of the first things I saw was that image of Emmett Till in Jet magazine, right? As a young boy. And I'm thinking, oh man, that was a really horrible time, right? And so you just thinking, I'm thinking like, that's the past, right? We're in brighter days, right? As I'm growing up, but always kind of had that mindset of justice. And I think that, as we've already kind of mentioned a few times here, that moment with Trayvon Martin shifted things, right? But then after Trayvon, you see Michael Brown, then you see Freddie Gray, right? And you're seeing all of these things happen over and over again, and you realize, wow, this stuff hasn't really stopped, right? And so I think that during the George Floyd, that whole moment, that whole summer, as I'm standing in front of these tanks, right? These military weapons, right? For people who are just simply saying, I want to live in a world that's freer and more loving. And that was seen as a threat, right? And I'm looking at high school age kids who should be graduating outside, risking their lives for a better world, right? And at that moment, the term that's being thrown around, and that was my thought and my belief at the time, was reform, right? Like, how do we do police reform? How do we do, this word reform was being thrown around, right? And that's just how I, naturally understood things. But, as I think that during that summer, I really began to look at this idea of what is reform. And as Paige, has already eloquently pointed out, is that you begin to realize that like reform is part of the reason that we're still in the place that we're in, right? Because we're just making things pretty. How do we make racism more prettier? That's essentially the depth of this, right? Like, how do we make policing sexier, right? Like, how do we make it in a way where we can be more comfortable with it? But the reality is that there's something deeper underneath this, and I think that that's what abolition is helping us begin to see, is that the question, as you've pointed out, particularly after, particularly after slavery, my thought was, okay, abolition is over, right? Like, okay, that's how I understood abolition, connected to chattel slavery. But then you begin to realize, yes, chattel slavery was abolished, but the idea of free labor wasn't, right? And how do we use free labor? So then what do? You start seeing convict leasing, right? You start seeing, sharecropping, right? Like all of these different components now where you realize, oh, labor is still being used in a way. Free labor is still being used in a way that, we just begin to shift it around, right? Like that was really, it was more reformation. Like we just reformed things, right? And like just being able to look at history, you begin to realize the question has always been, what do we do with free Black bodies, right? Like that's been the problem, right? That what do we do with these free Black bodies now? And as a result, you begin to criminalize Black skin, right? Like, and so seeing that thread of the criminalization of how you look it began to just kind of show me more and more that no, there's something deeper that we have to do here than just reforming, right? And even this idea of public safety. Who are we being saved from, right? Where is, like, what is the idea of safety, right? And I think ultimately what that time did for me is help me to realize it's like, oh, we've bought into a lot of myths. Because America can be a myth-making machine, right? Where we believe it and we assume that this is reality and this is just how things have just come to be and this is just a natural order of things. Abolition says no, that there's forces behind the way that systems are put in place. And we can't just get caught up in individual racism and how we personally feel about racism and how do we be less of a racist, but actually learning that there are structures in place that we have to deal with. And I think that that's what really began to kind of shift my mind away from just, oh, how do we just make things better and just kind of kick the can along the road, but actually being able to shift it. So.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful, I think, perspective for me, and I hope for us. Paige, I want to come back to you. And for Alliance folk, if you go back through our archives, in June of last year, there's a picture of a Black woman leading a rally outside of the Supreme Court. That was Paige. Paige allowed us to use that photo so that we could offer our reflections on that moment. And so one, I just want to sort of publicly thank you for that. But two, I wanted, to ask you, Paige, as you travel, as you have to sit with families, right, who reckon with the loss of loved ones in this particular way, and it may put you on the spot a bit, but, what would you want to say to a group of people who are committed in our mission to bring God's justice to the world? What would you say to a justice-oriented people about what you hear and see in the spaces that you are in, that we are not in, that perhaps we need to know?
I think the short of it would be that we need you, especially as I'm looking in this group of people. We need specifically white people to be doing this work as well. And so how can you do that? It's really understanding, trying to gather my thoughts on this. One, it's that these systems inflict devastation, and it's one thing to say that, but I urge you to look at the first press conference we did with Jayland Walker's family. His mother learned during that press conference that there were 94 shots fired at her son, and she screams, and it's unlike anything. I want to say it's unlike anything I'd ever heard, but unfortunately, with my work with Attorney Crump, we hear it quite often. You will never hear anything close to a mother losing her child and losing her child in that way. I said it then and I'll say it now, we don't treat animals that way. There are rules when you go hunting for when you can hunt, what you can do when you hunt, and good hunters will tell you how you kill an animal somewhat ethically. And to know that these families will get no justice. that there will be nothing that can bring Pam Walker, her son, back. But not just that, but that she also had to sit and listen to the Attorney General of Ohio describe why this was justified and why those same police officers are not only back at work, which they are back at work, but will not lose their jobs. They will not lose their pension. They will continue to have guns and continue to still police that community. And so when I say that we need you, I have said this quite often, but I believe that we are in a state of emergency and that we have been for quite some time. And that things like this device right here, which I use quite often, I can't lie, but things like our phones allow us to be distracted from what's happening. You don't have to see it. And part of why that photo was released in the case of Jayland Walker, and if you haven't seen that photo, I urge you to look at it. It shows you exactly what the police did to him, and it shows you what 46 bullets in someone looks like, is because we need people to care. And we need people to talk about this and to talk about it with some sense of urgency, because what we know, and what many people on this stage know, is that there will be another Jayland Walker. The names that we hear, unfortunately, one of the most powerful things that I've learned in civil rights work are the names that you don't hear. Attorney Crump has to tell families each and every day that their case will not survive in court. Because there's a thing called qualified immunity. And that makes it so that police officers in this country, as long as they are reasonable and they haven't violated a previously set well-known law, that there is no liability whatsoever. Same thing with prosecutors. They're given what's called absolute immunity, which means that they cannot be prosecuted or civilly liable for anything that they do in a case. So I have to tell you all, it's so humbling to sit in this room and to see so many people that don't look like me so interested in this conversation. And if there's anything that I can say to you all, it's tell your family now, tell your friends now. What Eli was saying, I am loud, and I do like to yell, but we need you out there with us. We need you out there yelling with us. As we know, there has been nothing that's changed in this country for us easily. Nothing has been given to us, and nothing has been fair. And what we know is that it was white people who helped in that civil rights movement that got us the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we need you really badly.
Thank you, Paige. I wrote down, we need people, and I think especially white people, white institutions, white organizations, historically white, even those like ours that strive towards multiculturalism, to care. And people who can talk about this with urgency. That's why we're here, y'all. Because this is urgent. And part of our job is to excavate the urgency. To go as deep as we need to go to feel it. Because it's urgent. You at court this week? You have stuff to do on this next week? Are you still black? Where did the tanks go? Did they go away? It's urgent. And I think part of our job is to, what Brian Stevenson says is that you can't understand things from far away. You gotta get close. You gotta get proximate. This is a way for us to get proximate, to get close. Sure.
When you were saying to get proximate, I think that we see exactly what happens when that happened, right? Like in DC, when January 6th protesters had to be incarcerated at the DC jail, we've been talking about DC jail reform for quite a while. But as soon as January 6th protesters were held there was a federal investigation. And every single federal inmate was moved from the facility in less than 5 days. When people saw what was happening in jails, they said, this is outrageous. Even I'm gonna butcher her name, Marjorie Green Taylor. She's now calling for prison abolition. And so it's interesting to see what happened. Right, she's like, defund things now. It's interesting. We've been on that. But it goes to show what happens when you get close. Immediately after those federal prisoners were shipped off, we were in court saying, hey, what about the DC citizens there who were not being fed? My client's tray was taken, they took a picture of his tray because he was given a raw egg for breakfast and was not fed for lunch and dinner. And when I explained that to the judge, that people need sustenance to live and that there's standing feces in the cells and that the guards will turn off the water to play with the inmates, exactly what the federal investigation yielded, the judge told me, well, he's not being shackled to the wall and beaten. If that was happening, then I'd release him. And so I wanted to tell you all, when you really look at what's happening here, it's not a joke. LaShawn Thompson, who Attorney Crump represents right now, was found with bed bugs in his eyes, in his nose, and throughout his mouth. It's not a joke at all.
Sure.
And to add to that, as a person who works in Manhattan criminal court, whenever the former president came through a couple weeks ago, there were the similar calls of how the justice system was treating him and how if he could get arrested, anybody can be arrested, which is one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard in my life. And so you see, as Paige says, when folks who obviously are not used to being subjected to that treatment, that violence, those conditions, when they see it, it really sparks in their minds that this is not right, this is not just. And it's the exact same things that we have been saying for centuries, right? And we obviously are trying to make those things prevalent. And as Paige said, the more people who are invested in this work, the better, to make it clear to people who say that they represent us that we are not for continuing to build jails, build prisons, continue to expand police budgets endlessly while we cut education, while we cut healthcare, while we cut everything else to give us real hope, to give us a real chance at living and surviving and happiness, right? And so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so you can add to that while Trey's speaking. Carol, can you help me to field questions? We have about 24, 25 or so minutes to take a few questions. So maybe, actually, you use that mic and I'll give Carol this one to field questions that people may have for them or for me. And Trey, you can offer your thoughts. So
Yeah.
be thinking about if you have questions. Questions.
As both Paige and Jeremy were talking, I'm thinking about this also from like a theological side, right? And particularly Howard Thurman has a quote in Jesus and the Disinherited where he says, there's a difference between the religion of Jesus and Jesus's religion, right? And so often we can get caught up in the religion of Jesus, which has become a brand that is foundationally set in the idea that a God of punishment, right? But I think if we were to dig into Jesus's religion, it's the opposite, right? And we see that in Luke 4:18, right? Where it's, set the captives free, right? Bring sight to the blind, right? Helping the oppressed, right? That there is this liberation aspect, and also like, and Jesus almost comes in this way of doing abolition work, right? That we have to be able to transform the conditions, because abolition isn't necessarily just about deconstruction, but it's also about creation, right? And so when we begin to understand God as creator and God as harmony and relationality, I think that also helps us begin to kind of shift these conversations that are centered around punishment. Because that's the root of a lot of the things that we're talking about is how do we punish people, right? But not necessarily how do we help edify and build up people, bring resources to the community, set the captives free, right? And do the things that are necessary to help our communities.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll take a couple questions.
Am I white? I think so. I was born and raised in Goodman, Mississippi, in a town of 400 white people surrounded by 15,000 black people. I listen as the younger black people on the stage see, hear, and feel the injustice in their experience today. And it is an experience that is dramatically different from what I saw in the life of their ancestors where I grew up. But the question that should not be ignored is so much more complex. Why did it all happen as it really did? As it really did. And what can we learn today from the truth about yesterday? I listen to you and I feel compelled to say, I was there, I saw it. And I'm about to tell you this because of the woman who raised me. She was black, and she loved me. And she taught me to love God. We are in a house of God here. Remember this, the solution, you made a beautiful comment, white people can help. But the solution is to bring the next generation to understand that God loves us all and keep our faith focused on that. Thank you.
Tell me your name again.
What's that?
Are your name again?
No, but I don't know if you would consider me that or not, but my great-grandmother was what is called in the Old South an octoroon. So I have African American or African ancestors.
Wow.
I have Native American ancestors.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But I understand how to love people of color because of the experience I had with the woman that raised me.
So thank you for those remarks. And if there's another question, I think back there. I mean, I think what I want to respond to is what you said about God teaching us about love. I grew up in the South. I went to church almost every Sunday until I was 32 years old. And while I heard about God's love, when I studied Louisiana, my home state, in college history class, I learned that the history of the streets of the cities, Pointe-Coupee, Louisiana, East Feliciana Parish, Jefferson Parish, Livingston Parish, were not structured in such a way that love could flourish. I went to Catholic high school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the guy who was a year older than me and played football with me and Jeremy was Officer Blaine Salamone, who killed Alton Sterling. Had a question for my Christian high school. They missed something in what they taught all of us about love? Why wasn't Blaine thinking about that day? So it's not just about hearing the question of love, but how do we materialize it? Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So how do we make love look material in public? A question back here?
Yeah. My first question is, how can we nurture that working for justice and peace is a spiritual journey, number one. Number two, it seemed like there's a conflict between culture and the cross. And for example, as a Palestinian Arab Christian in Galilee, I always looked for Easter. I never looked for Christmas. So in college and seminary, I discovered that early Christianity did not say hello to Christmas until 400 years after. The big deal was Easter. I mean, in America, we get ready for Christmas, September, October, November, December. Easter comes and goes and nobody feels it. So that means the culture eats the cross and the church, number one. The last thing I wanted to say is contextual, like the Cherokee people in North Georgia. They wanted to say to the people in Atlanta, I love Jesus, they had a church. I love education, they had a school. I love the judicial system, they had a court. But when we wanted the land, we said goodbye to your Jesus and we sent him to Oklahoma, 50% died. Okay? The same thing with this whole deal in Texas. The president said, everyone needs to be freed January 1, 1863. And all the states abided.
Yeah.
Okay, the governor, want to be elected, he can be quiet. The senator can be quiet because they need the vote. Everybody, the plantation owner are greedy. The business people are greedy. But why in the name of God, the minister and the church stayed quiet from January 1, 1863, 64, 65 to June 19?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, especially I think when you frame it through this conflict between sort of culture and the cross, right? And it's funny that you would say it's a conflict between culture and the cross, because I'm thinking about our gathering last year, which was about rethinking the cross and the meaning of the cross. And then when we think about the cross as this sort of Christian symbol, I'm trying to give you, Trey and Alexis, time to think about your response. I'm coming to you all as the theologians. When we think about the cross in Christianity, and then through James Cone's contribution to our interpretation of the cross. He said he saw it too in Bearden, Arkansas, next to the lynching tree. Think about this conflict between the cross and culture. You know, I guess to maybe, you know, reframe the question, right, is I guess as people of the cross, if that's what Christians are, y'all gotta help me further make sense of that. You know, what does that symbol say to us in this conversation? You know, how can the cross help us? Or maybe it can't help us.
That's a good question. I think for me, once again, I feel like my ideology, my theology has shifted over the years. I think particularly when I think about the cross right now, what I say every Easter is that Jesus, you know, as we think about that story, Jesus didn't just die, but Jesus was killed, right? And I think just even framing that kind of shifts it a little bit, right? Because of the fact is that why was Jesus killed? Because there was a particular culture and system that was intact that was death dealing, right? And so as we as we bring it to this day and age, right, there's still systems in place that are death dealing, right? And so people are still being killed as a result of this, which means that Jesus took a side, right? And I think that we have to, you know, as we talk about the urgency right now, right? Like, this is more than a sentimental fight. This is more than our emotions and how we feel about injustice and things of that nature, but it's actually bringing flesh to the word, right? And the word became flesh, right? And so what does that look like for us as we become more than just words, but embodied words? And words that are in flesh that go out and realize that there is a system in place, because that's what it is. It's being able to name what's going on, and then not only name it, but to live it existentially against this particular system that's in place, right? And I think that that's where the cross is now landing for me, is that as I look at it more, is that there is a culture that kills. And we have to be able to name it, that the fact that culture kills, right? And so we got to do that cultural work, which I think Jesus was doing, right? How do we not just change culture, but transform it?
Yeah, and I'll add to that, similarly to Trey, I was thinking about state-sanctioned violence. So Jesus was killed by the Roman Empire in state-sanctioned violence. And all I've been thinking about, as y'all have been talking, especially Paige, is that injustice and inequities, these words don't quite get at what we're experiencing. For someone to be shot that many times and a mother to have to experience that in that moment, Ralph, y'all, ever since I've heard about this story, has been sitting with me every day, that the 16-year-old can't go to the wrong house without getting shot in the head, shot in the arm. I was talking to my mom yesterday, and I was like, and then what do you do after that? Go make dinner? Like, what is happening? Like, what kind of world do we live in where you can do that? And it's like, as if that's not heartbreaking enough, for a child to have to go to 3 different homes to get help, to go to the first house and not get help, to go to the second house and be bleeding and not, to go to the third house and to get help, but before you get help, you have to get on the ground and put your hands up before someone gives you help. Like, injustice is not even a word anymore, right? And I think about what George James and Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about a lot. We are at war. And I remember having these sessions with the Alliance of Baptist staff. Dr. James talks about even sometimes our conversations around anti-racism airbrushes war, meaning it softens the fact that we are at war. This is warfare, that this is what we are experiencing, Black folks particularly, day in and day out. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, the way that policing works is that it's warfare stitched with lawfare, so that it gets covered with what we call the thin blue line, but basically there's a covering for the warfare that is going on. And the standard, which is what she says, is very low, is that I fear for my life. That's the standard. And this is the war that we are at day in and day out. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it being a state-sanctioned crucifixion with Jesus is that lynching is supposed to send a message. It's not just about the killing itself. It sends a message to the rest of the community that if you dare to rise up against the state, this is what's going to happen to you as well. So I think the idea of having a community that backs you is a big deal because if the state can see, okay, we can do that to you, but that you have all these people who are going to rise up with you, that sends a message to the state while the state is trying to send a message to us, because that's us fighting back. And I'm sorry, I said that was the last thing, but the last thing I'll say. I'm going to say this because I think it's important to talk about this when we talk about abolition. Political prisoners are the ones who show us that example of sacrifice and what it means to stand up to the state. And also it shows what happens when the state fights back. So there are 2 political prisoners right now in the state of Indiana that I'm helping to hopefully get free soon. John Balogun Cole and Christopher Naim Trotter, who a fellow inmate was getting beat by guards, and we're in Indiana. So the guards were tied to the KKK, and we're very open about that. They beat this man nearly to death. Cole and Trotter stood up for this man. Long story short, they got 84 years, 142 years in prison, spent several decades in solitary confinement, and are still in prison right now, and we're trying to get them out. The jury, the judge, everybody was clearly in cahoots, as well as with the guards. But if they are still in prison and we're not fighting to get them free, as well as all the political prisoners who have come before them, then that sends a message to the state that they can keep doing this. We can keep killing your children, we can keep killing your cousins, we can keep killing your mothers, we can keep killing your brothers and your fathers, and nothing is going to happen with us. And something else that Dr. Joy James says is that an apology is not a resurrection. So anytime the state apologizes, that's not if the state cannot resurrect your children, they cannot kill them. So we are in a fight and we are in warfare, and it's time for us to be honest about that instead of trying to airbrush it. We are at war. So what are we going to do when we are at war?
All right, we're almost at time. I'm looking at the 12:27. Okay, so I'll let one more question, then we'll close out. The good thing is that Paige, Jeremy, Alexis, and Trey are here this weekend. They're specifically here so that you can talk to them, you can ask questions about their work, you can engage them in some conversation. So for those questions who aren't being able to be asked, know that they're here as resources to learn more through the weekend. We'll take.
I'm Jennifer Brown. I'm a former chaplain for a women's prison, and nearly every woman I worked with was a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence. And so in this conversation where my prophetic imagination gets stuck is, what does justice look like that's not this system? Particularly for those of you who work kind of adjacent to it or in it, what are you imagining for the families of those murdered by police officers? What does justice look like that's not just the same thing?
So I think that's an important question as we talk about state violence against people and what to do with people who inflict that violence and just people who inflict harm and violence in general. I think that's a question that a lot of people struggle with when we're talking about abolition and talking about taking down the system that everybody has known for their whole life and trying to do something different. I think that the first part of the question is that, or the first part of the answer to that is that I don't believe that there is a real, the justice that would come from somebody inflicting harm, to me, it doesn't look like that person being incarcerated or suffering harm or violence themselves, right? a lot of people talked about it before, like we right now have like a punishment system and we punish those who inflict that violence. And so I think that in trying to reshape and reframe our thoughts about harm and violence and people who do inflict that, we should think about how those harms come to be in the first place. And think about, if you're talking about sexual violence, whatever patriarchy, things that we have that where men or people enact violence against those who are less in power, right? And so abolition is about deconstructing all of these systems that make it allowable for these harms to be inflicted in the first place, and to try to make it so that individuals who cause harm or may cause harm can, one, not inflict that harm against somebody else by means of trying to have them, I guess, have the resources and wherewithal and knowledge to know what they are doing to their other people. And so, I mean, I think there has been, like, people talk about restorative justice as one thing, where people who have caused harm can meet with those who are their supposed victims, and they can do some sort of mediation and try to figure out exactly like how these things have come about and see if there's a way to move forward, or even if there's not a way to move forward, to let that person know like how harmful their actions have been. And so I think that may be a starting point. I think that that's something that has been that has been introduced in small forms in some places, that component of restorative justice. But it is something that is, I think, difficult to wrestle with. But I think that it always helps for me to think about like what could have prevented this thing from happening. It doesn't always help us to just, do something after the fact. We have to like think about the things that produce these outcomes and how we got to this point. And so that to me is like, I think the question that I always like try to come back to as a way to try to figure out exactly like how these harms have been caused. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I'm down to talk more about it if you would like. Want to say?
Okay. Okay. About the gun violence. So the question was primarily, Brand was saying that she's on board with all that has been discussed, but she's deeply concerned about gun violence. So how do you think about how gun violence kind of fits into this? And we'll let your response to that page be the last word.
Yeah, and so at least, I don't know specifically in your community what's happening, but in DC, there's a lot of young folks with guns. And so as Jeremy was talking about, being proactive versus reactive is what's key here. And so these kids who have guns don't have a whole lot to do after school. They are involved with other kids who also don't have things to do after school. They're also in communities that are over-policed and that are infested with violence. And so when you put that all together, that's a recipe for disaster, and that's what we're seeing. So I think that getting in the communities and doing the work is really what's important here. Finding out what is happening in this community, whether it's we don't have any after school programs, we don't have any weekend programs. Because what I've learned about children, and in the DC PD's office, we have a whole section for juveniles. And what I've learned about children is that they really they don't want to be in violence-ridden communities. They don't want to be in positions that they feel like they have to defend themselves or that they have to carry protection in order to be safe. And once we get in those communities and make them safer, meaning we remove police, because police don't make our communities safer. They are not mental health experts. They're not experts on anything except for inflicting violence. And so when we remove those barriers, we put educational systems in place, we put extracurricular activities in place, and we fund those communities and make them safe places to live, then you see a response with the amount of guns that are in this country. Also, I'm not quite sure why common sense gun legislation is just not being passed, given what we have right now.
Friends, there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more to see. There's so much more to learn about. There's so many more questions that we can ask. You want to make, come and make the announcements, and then I'll offer a benediction as we go and a blessing over the food.
Hello? Oh, okay. Hey, I just wanted to come back and quickly address why we're going to be virtual next year. I made the announcement, and then I have seen some folks and some faces. So I want to come back and say that we are going to be, the reason why we're virtual next year, I'll just keep it there, is that we have made a commitment to try to be as accessible as we possibly can to all of our community and all of our partnerships. Some of those partnerships are international. Some of those partnerships are in places where people cannot travel as easily. And so all of the Alliance community, we want to make this as accessible to them as possible. We also have to think about folks who have health issues. What does it mean to be traveling? Because COVID is not over, even though I don't have a mic. I mean, the mask on. Anyway, but COVID is still very real. We have folks who have issues around travel. What does it mean for them physically in terms of their health? And then even financially, even though the Alliance does tend to trend, we have trended in the past to be like more upper middle class, the more diverse we become, that also means financially. So just understand that we do prioritize being together. It is important. And we have to balance that with our commitment to be as inclusive as possible. So, so that's why. So I hope that you guys will be able to receive that in the spirit in which we offer it.
Thank you. Thank you, Malou. And right after this, we'll head to lunch. And Malou gave us instructions for lunch earlier, right before us. We're picking up our lunches, and you can eat throughout the church area. Let me just offer this word. Thank you to Paige, to Jeremy, to Trey, to Alexis. You all are brilliant, you're brave, and you're doing the work of the prophets. And what I want to say to you all as the Alliance, as we keep moving further into this weekend, I want there to be more moments in the sun. And I want us to be a part of that. Go in peace.